Welcome, everybody, to Bookworm number 80. I'm Angela Unk, Director of Development at the Clements Library, and your host this morning. I'm so happy to have you all here, so thank you so much for joining us online for this live conversation. And I'll just go over, whoops, that is not in the right spot. There we go. Just go over a couple of things about Zoom, just in case you're joining us for the first time. We do use chat, and you're welcome to chime in and keep the conversation going. Just select everyone so that everyone can see your comments. And my colleague Katie will be monitoring the chat and also pasting in helpful links and information. However, because the chat goes by very fast, please make sure that if you have questions for Susanna, that you put those in the Q&A section. You can also give a thumbs up to upvote a question that somebody else has asked so that it goes to the top of the queue. We do have the live machine captions turned on, so please toggle those on or off as you choose and change the size so that it fits your needs. And side-by-side mode is enabled because I can only control so much of what you see. So play around with your screen a little bit so that it's comfortable and you can see both the slides and the presenters. This program is brought to you by the William L. Clements Library, located on the campus of the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor. The Clements Library's mission is to collect, preserve, share, and promote the study and discussion of primary sources related to all aspects of history and culture of North America and the Caribbean up to about 1900. I would also like to acknowledge that the University of Michigan is located on the territory of the Anishinaabe people. In 1817, the Ojibwa, Ottawa, and Potawatomi nations made the largest single land donation to the University of Michigan, offered ceremonially as a gift in the text of the Treaty of the Foot of the Rapids, so that their children could be educated in a Western manner. We acknowledge the history of Native displacement that allowed the University of Michigan to be founded. Today, we reaffirm contemporary and ancestral Anishinaabe ties to this land and their profound contributions to this institution. The William L. Clements Library acknowledges that it has and continues to benefit from the original land dispossession and established hierarchies of settler colonialism. I am delighted to thank our friends at the Alumni Association of the University of Michigan for sponsoring today's episodes. They're great partners and provide great programming from all aspects of our university. So thank you so much for your support in the things that we do. We appreciate you. So today, I am delighted to welcome today's guest, joining us from Delft in the Netherlands, where she is currently a visiting scholar with the Global Slavery Consortium at the University of Leiden, is Susanna Ashton, professor of English at Clemson University. An expert on slavery and freedom narratives, she was a Dubois Fellow at Harvard's Hutchins Center, a fellow with Yale's Gilder Lehrman Center, and a Fulbright Scholar. She has authored, edited, or co-authored multiple titles on American literary and cultural history. And she joins the Bookworm today to discuss her book, A Plausible Man, the true story of the escaped slave who inspired Uncle Tom's Cabin. So welcome, Susanna.
Hello.
And I am going to stop sharing so that you can share.
Okay, so when do we talk about the poll? Just at the end, the middle?
You're right. I did skip it, didn't I?
Oh.
All right. Hold on one moment. Let's talk about the poll. I will end the poll question. And oops, what did I just do? And then we can talk about the poll. All right. Did everybody click? Oh, a lot of people clicked. End poll, share results so we can see where we ended.
Okay, should I announce the result?
I think so. Yes.
All right, I'm going to dive in. The answer is a little ambiguous. So all three of those answers have a call to be right, but probably the best one would be no, it was sort of quasi illegal. Basically, people in the very early part of the 19th century, there were a couple, just a handful, but they were terrible, of incidents of fugitives from enslavement in America who were sent back. And often they were sent back because they were considered thieves, because they were wearing, say, a jacket or a piece of clothing that had been, quote, given to them, or lent to them from an enslaver in the South. One enslaver claimed that a slave had stolen his horse, and so when he made to Canada, he was returned. So some of that they were turned that kind of extradition because there was a normal extradition for criminals. Whether or not self-theft was a crime was sort of very ambiguous. And entering, we didn't have formal entry and immigration law quite the way we do today. So it was a very gray area in the 1850s when enslaved people started coming into Canada in significant numbers. They were tolerated more than warmly welcomed, I think is a way to think of it. And I'm going to discuss a little bit of that interesting border history later on in my talk. So I thought it was a provocative question because we like to imagine people, fleeing bondage and finding welcome. And that, like most of history and most of the world, it's a little more complicated than that. And boundary movement is tricky now, as we well know, and it was complicated then too. But I am hoping to sort of some of the ambiguity there perhaps can maybe broaden our vocabulary to think about challenges on such issues today. Thank you.
Thank you. All right, so now you can share your slides.
All right, I will dive right in. There you go. Can you see it?
Yes, indeed.
Okay, terrific. All right. Well, thank you so much for inviting me. Thank you, Paul. I did some of my work way back at the American Antiquarian Society. This project took many, many years, over a decade, in putting together pieces of clues. It's not just a historical or literary work. It's also very much a work that's very about the primary sources. I'm really interested in talking about what is an archival source. How can we read something? How do we learn to read documents differently with sort of contemporary knowledge that we have that people didn't have then? So I'm going to be sharing, perhaps it will thrill and perhaps it will bore you, but I love just showing, a page of a census and a page of a document. I'm a great believer in sort of sharing images of sort of the research along the way. So thank you for your patience. I'll also tell you, you do not need to have read Uncle Tom's Cabin to understand what I'm going to talk about, nor do you need to have heard of John Andrew Jackson. Almost nobody has, so that's fine. Of course, you all will by the end of this. But yeah, I'm interested in this as a bit of literary history. But I'm not just interested in Uncle Tom's Cabin. I'm interested in the ways we talk about the history of literary influences as well. So you can tell those are some of the big perspectives. I'm going to dive right in and say that when I started working on this, I live in South Carolina. I work at Clements University, a big public university there. And I started teaching a lot about the writing and witness testimony of enslaved people. And I started looking at sort of little known or unpublished. I didn't discover these things. They're sort of known already by archivists and a couple of scholars, but they were certainly not publicly available easily or just little known. I started looking at them. And one of the ones I got really interested in was this one that had been published in England by a man named John Andrew Jackson. And I read his memoir, which was very short. And I said, there's a lot more to this story. And hence the story began to unfold for me. And I realized there was a really wonderful mystery at the core. So he opens his book by saying, I was born in South Carolina. My grandfather was stolen from Africa. My father learned the African method of curing snake bites and was, in consequence, called Dr. Clavering. And that opening line is perhaps one of my most important clues. It took me a long time of staring at it, like, several months and weeks, before I actually thought to look at the name Dr. Clavering in an interesting way. And that ended up being a story that opened up how I was able to connect with Jackson's descendants. Because the name Dr. Clavering begins to show up in generation after generation. Not the name Jackson, and Jackson is an assumed name that he had, but the name Clavering or Clavon and spellings like that are the rest of his family. Indeed, Jim Clyburn, the representative from South Carolina, civil rights hero. I have never been able to actually track it genealogically, but I'm pretty sure his family was from the same area, and there must be a distant connection somehow, but that's a story for another day. So John Andrew Jackson had a big, long, crazy life, and I pieced a little bit together from his memoir and a lot from other sources that I'll share as I'll go along. What I'm going to do is I'll tell you a little bit about his life very quickly, and then I'll slow down and unpack it a bit. And then I'll show you another chunk of his life, and I'll unpack it a bit. So here we go. It's a ride, I tell you. Okay, he was born in Sumter, South Carolina. He was enslaved by a family called the English family. And he eventually marries, and he falls in love with a girl named Louisa, who was enslaved at an adjacent plantation. And together they had a little girl, Ginny. His wife is forcibly, as he uses the phrase, remarried, which you can imagine all sorts of horrors there, and you're probably right. And she is sent away to Georgia with little Ginny. He is devastated, heartbroken, furious. He's a man who thinks he has nothing left to lose anymore in his life. And he flees on horseback. He gets a horse. He sort of, cryptically legal or illegal way, he sort of trades and hides a horse that he sort of obtains. And he flees some 150 miles to Charleston, South Carolina. He manages to smuggle himself aboard a Boston-bound vessel in February of 1847. So let's look at some of that. For those of you who don't know the geography, he's from an area which is quite far inland, so he's not coastal. So really his first escape was across land and was very, very dangerous. And this he does talk about in some detail in his memoir. So I do know about this stage of his escape. The pictures aren't so great here, sorry, but that first one is a terrible picture I took, which is the house still standing where Louisa's enslavers lived. And on the bottom is a photograph of a very similar looking house, which was sort of just nearby, no longer standing, but that's where Jackson's enslavers lived. And presumably he lived in sort of cabins with his family, with other workers in the back. One of the moments where I began to realize, and I'm telling the story chronologically, but of course, research never unfolds chronologically. But the moment where I really began to see the story of Jackson unfold was when, through a lot of labor and hunting, because the newspapers were not fully digitized in South Carolina when I started doing this research, I managed to find an advertisement for John Andrew Jackson. $50 reward. He ran away from the English plantations labor camp. It's not clear if Jackson is a first or a last name there. It's just what he's used. What's satisfying about this, though, I will call out, is they seem to think he had gone off to Georgia to find his wife. And what's nice is when the dates are aligned, he's actually in Massachusetts by the time they put this. They were looking in totally the wrong direction, which is nice to know. But also note the phrase, he speaks plausibly. That wasn't an uncommon term at the time. It was often used for somebody who is quick-witted or, can talk you out of things or lies a lot, but who is, going to define himself in a way that the enslaver does not wish him to be defined. But again, one of the characteristics I learn about Jackson as his story unfolds is he is a talker. He talks his way out of trouble. He talks his way into trouble. People are charmed by him and his storytelling and his public speaking later on, but they're also sometimes irritated by him, and he gets in trouble for insulting people and talking back and gets thrown off trains. And so his loquaciousness is his greatest strength and his greatest weakness, I think. But so speaks plausibly began to be the term that bounced around in my head and turned to be the title of the book. Now, John Andrew Jackson, it has no name, no connection to the president. He just adopted that name. And he likes using that middle name. So it's not John Jackson. He really likes John Andrew Jackson in almost everything he wrote or identifies himself. He gets to Massachusetts. He works in a tannery. He starts speaking in public. And then he is forced to flee further north in the fall of 1850, thanks to new revisions of the Fugitive Slave Act, which said that basically enslaved people will be forcibly removed, and there are very few legal protections for them anymore. And it was a pretty devastating legislation. He was assisted somewhat by the Underground Railroad at this point. So his first escape was entirely on his own. His second one was a little bit more organized, with some people who did give him money. They did tell him to go house to house. He connected with a bunch of activists in Massachusetts and Maine. And at one point on this route, he got directed to a house owned by, lived in by Harriet Beecher Stowe and her family. And I'll tell you about that. And by spring 1851, he makes it to Canada and remarries there. All right, so that's this big chunk of life. That's a lot of information. Let's slow it down a bit. He in Massachusetts, he found a black boarding house. Sailors helped him. Black sailors on the boat he escaped on directed him to a black boarding house where he made friends, and I think really got a little bit politicized there. The African-American community in Massachusetts was really getting organized. So there wasn't just the white abolitionists, it was African-American people too, who were lining up speakers and money and resistance. And I learned that the head of this boarding house himself was quite an activist and raised money for the to help pay lawyers and fees to support fugitives who were under attack. So John Andrew Jackson had gone to a good place. So he makes it north, and he's going house to house, being directed by people, and he ends up pretty much on the campus of Bowdoin College. And the campus of Bowdoin College is basically the town of Brunswick, Maine. In Brunswick, Maine, he goes to the house of a math teacher, Smythe, S-M-Y-T, perhaps Smith, but I think it's Smythe. And we know about this Maine incident, not so much from Jackson. He only writes like a couple of sentences really about what happens to him in Maine in his memoir. But we know more about it because of a letter that Harriet Beecher Stowe wrote, which, again, I didn't discover the letter. Scholars had known about this letter, but no one had ever put it together with this memoir. And I was able to take Jackson's memoir and Stowe's letter and find out how these stories perfectly align and reinforce one another. So Harriet Beecher Stowe was a faculty wife at the time. She had many children. She had done some magazine writing here and there. She was sort of a very low-level writer, earning just a little bit of pin money, you might say, now and then. She was, of course, the sister to some of the most famous evangelical and preachers of the time. Her father was incredibly prominent. Her husband was a prominent scholar and religious author who was now teaching at Bowdoin. And so her whole family had sort of moved up to Maine. Unfortunately, her family, and it's sort of a long story, but her husband had taken this job at Bowdoin, which was a great academic job, but he hadn't completely resigned from his other academic job. It's one of those academic contracts are a mess even today, and it seems very modern, this kind of mess up. And he wasn't able to start on time at Bowdoin, which really irked the administration at Bowdoin College. But nonetheless, his wife, she was pregnant. She had to get there. She was about to have a baby, so she moved with her family up to take the house. And Calvin Stowe, her husband, was going to sort of come up now and then a little bit, but then sort of formally join them and start teaching officially, maybe in January or February at a later date. So that's why she was up in Maine. And she wrote a letter to her sister about a very interesting incident that happened in December. Oh, sorry. She started talking about her neighbor. She's become very good friends with a local minister and his wife, and they are good people. But the husband is sort of square, can I say? And he's very much, he thinks the fugitive slave law is a terrible, terrible thing, but he wouldn't dare to resist it or to break the law or to be an activist against it in any way. He will lobby against it or he will speak against it, but he would never disobey the law. And Stowe feels differently. And so she talks to her sister about the conversations she had with her neighbor. She says, he and I had over the tea table the other night that sort of argument, which consists of both sides saying over and over just what they said before for any length of time. And we've all been in those conversations, right? But when I asked him flatly if he would obey the law, supposing a fugitive come to him, Mrs. Upham laughed and he hemmed and hawed, and little Mary Upham broke out, I wouldn't, I know. Well, the next day there come along a fugitive bound for Canada, and Smythe serves him right up to Prof. Upham, who takes him into his study and hears his story, gives him $1, and Mrs. Upham puts him bountifully in the provision line, and then he comes here for lodging. Now, our beds were all full, and before this passed, I might have tried to send him somewhere else. As it was, all hands in the house united in making him up a bed in our waste room, and Henry and Freddie and Georgie seemed to think they could not do too much for him. They hung around him and seemed never tired of hearing him talk and sing. He was a genuine article from the old Caroline estate. Now, she wrote more than that. She talks about giving him a little bit of money, listening to his story. And Jackson, in his memoir, had written, on my escape, I met this woman named Harriet Beecher Stowe who gave me money. And I remember when I first read that memoir, I was like, oh, surely he's exaggerating. She was an incredibly famous writer. He was just sort of name dropping. Maybe he had met her once in passing, but was sort of exaggerating. He's not always 100% reliable. So I was a little careful. And then I found this letter and realized it aligned perfectly with what he had said. And what's more important is she wasn't famous. She wasn't well known. She really, again, she was just a faculty wife and a sort of low level, not particularly successful occasional magazine writer at this time. And there were a lot of clues in the story that became very interesting to me. One of them is this phrase you can see she wrote, he was a genuine article from the old Caroline estate. See those little quote marks there around the word. And what is that a reference to? And I did some digging and learned it was a minstrel song, which had become very popular just a year or two previously, had sort of swept the nation as, popular minstrel songs were, and it was being sung all over the country. And not only is it a reference to South Carolina and a fugitive slave, but it is also, well, it wasn't at that point it was a reference to South Carolina, but it's also a song that Jackson wrote about in his own memoir. So we know Jackson knew that song. That song was called Dearest May. And like a lot of minstrel tunes, had some very offensive language in it, using the N-word. But I'll say when Jackson wrote it over for his own experiences and put it in his book, he changed the N-word. He wrote, now Freedman, listen to me, a story I'll relate. It happened in the valley in the old Carolina state, which sort of tells you a little bit about Jackson sort of no fear and making things his own. But so I began to realize every single thing aligned with Jackson's experiences in Maine, as Stowe had said. Indeed, I published the book. I'm excited about it. I'm proud of it. Published a lot of stuff in my life, but I think one of the most exciting legacies of my research and my career is that my research helped the Stowe House in Brunswick get federal recognition as a freedom seekers site. And that Brunswick and that Bowdoin has sort of revived the building that was completely decrepit when I first saw it, and has now sort of made it into a useful, maintained office. And to highlight the fact of not just Stowe, but an underground freedom site there. Anyway. So just fun little things. Here's another house in Maine. I know then Jackson went to visit Bath, because Stowe goes on to say, oh yes, then he went over to visit, the Reverend Ellingwood in a nearby town of Bath. And she said, this Ellingwood too had talked greatly about sustaining the Union, and Smythe sent the colored brother to him, and E gave him $1 and told him to put on for Canada. their hearts are better on this point than their heads. And that's a phrase which is important. Indeed, Stowe uses almost that exact sentence in talking about a scene in Uncle Tom's Cabin. But let me move forward. Last, I'll talk about Stowe a little bit more, but then I really want to return to Jackson, who's really the core of my story. So Uncle Tom's Cabin, well, after a vision while sitting in church in Maine in early winter of 1851, maybe probably January, most scholars agree, Stowe commences a 40-week newspaper serial novel called Uncle Tom's Cabin that she sells to the National Era, sort of small abolitionist activist newspaper, but doesn't have a big subscription base. But her story is so exciting. It was enormously successful. And indeed, the minute her book the serial is finished, it gets bought up to be published in 2 volumes in 1852. Eventually, it becomes the second best-selling book of the entire 19th century, second only to the King James Bible. Those of you who are printing scholars, I love you, and you'll not recognize it. The Hoe Rotary Press, new innovations in the Hoe Rotary Press were made specifically so they could keep up with the printing of the demand for Uncle Tom's Cabin. It was turned into a play. Later, there were film versions. So even people who had never read the book certainly or had it read to them, which was also very common in a family setting, but also just sort of knew about it from popular culture that you couldn't turn away. It was used in advertising gimmicks and songs and, shadow puppet plays and circuses. And so that's why the contemporary references are so common. Even today, for people who don't read it, it's not that commonly taught anymore. It's a complicated book for a number of reasons, and it's also really big. So it's not frequently taught. Perhaps some of you have read it. But yeah, that's why the references are so well known, even the book might not be. It was sold all over the world, immediately translated into many languages. So it became enormously popular immediately, and then it continued to be popular for decades and decades. It features a chapter about a senator who had been privately arguing with his wife about the Fugitive Slave Act. And suddenly a fugitive, in this case, a young woman named Eliza, arrives at the door, despite having just stated that he wouldn't break the law. As soon as he is with an actual person in fear and need, the senator changes his mind and helps her. We sort of have seen that, haven't we, with 2 characters? And Stowe writes his heart was better than his head. So you can just sort of see it. This scene is very much the scene of Jackson arriving in her book. Now, I don't want to spend a lot of time talking about Jackson as a model for anybody in the book. Indeed, if you saw the subtitle of my study is an inspiration, and I actually probably would have preferred the word instigation. I think there are other people's experiences she drew upon. There's a man named Josiah Henson we can talk about, who she later wrote had a parallel to her book, to her character of Uncle Tom. And Jackson never went around saying he was a model for anything. And Stowe doesn't talk about Jackson later on. But I think there's something very different about being, an abolitionist, being against slavery, being against legal problems with law, finding laws inhumane. And that's something very different to opening your door. Her husband was not there. Opening your door in the evening, in the winter, and bringing someone into your house with your children. That's a different emotional moment, a different development in your commitment to a righteous cause. And I think it changed her in that way. Importantly, I think that encounter helped launch another book as well. And in that case, I think it helped launch Jackson's, but we'll talk more about that going forward. Okay. So later, when citing her sources for information, she mentioned Jackson, she notes Josiah Henson. And so this guy, Josiah Henson, promoted himself often as the real Uncle Tom. That's fine. I don't think these are competing sort of ideas. Jackson's encounter with Stowe was a very different kind of encounter. But Uncle Tom had become a derogatory term in the 20th century for an overly acquiescent and passive person of color, maybe a traitor or things like that. If you read the book, Uncle Tom, the character is a martyr who is whipped to death and dies rather than reveal the whereabouts of women who are hiding from injustice and torture. So he's a hero in the book, whether or not that's relevant to the term used today, but I just want to address that. Okay, I'm going to turn back to Jackson a little bit now. So Jackson does get through Maine and he makes his way up to St. John in New Brunswick, Canada. This is not a common destination for fugitives. There was a free Black population there, many who had been there since the Revolutionary era, when with the British exodus from what became the United States, a number of both free and Black people were brought in various states of freedom and bondage to areas of Nova Scotia and New Brunswick. So there were some generations, but it was still a very small Black population. And I'm happy to say I don't know a ton about Jackson's life in Canada. In part, they had a terrible city fire, those 19th century fires that destroyed a lot of the records. All you archivists and librarians out there know what I'm talking about. But we do have voting records. And I was so touched to see in 1852, John Andrew Jackson was intending to stay. He registered as a voter. I don't know if he actually voted, but we have that astonishing register of voting. So he was committed to making Canada into the country he wanted it to be. Also, very powerfully, we have a page of the census that was taken for St. John that year. It listed the Black inhabitants, and it listed Jackson as his race wasn't listed as Black. His race, with a number of other people, was listed as United States. And what it was he was listed in this very ambiguous category of formerly enslaved people who were fugitives coming into Canada. And so they were, somewhat legal, somewhat illegal. Most people are just going to turn a blind eye. They weren't warmly welcomed in St. John. Black people were banned from almost every profession, not restricted or discouraged, legally banned from most professions. They weren't allowed to live in the center of the city. Again, that's not like by culture and practice, that's by actual legislation and city mandates. So St. John was a difficult place, but they did have a kind of freedom they couldn't have had in the United States. And again, as I say, it's so touching, that voter registry. So in 1856, he apparently has learned that his first wife has died, Louisa. And so he remarries another fugitive that he meets in Canada, Julia. I've become very interested in Julia. I don't know enough about her yet. There may be a book in there about Julia, I think, someday. She was also a fugitive from North Carolina. And I suspect she may have been somewhat educated. I think she may have been literate for various reasons. But that's another story I can speculate about in the Q&A. He gives over 50 independent lectures in Scotland, England, hoping to raise money to purchase relatives in South Carolina. So in Canada, he's in Canada for a couple of years, and he gets even more radicalized, but realizes in order to actually earn enough money to buy his father, buy his sister, he talks about his nephews and nieces. He has many, many family members in South Carolina he's desperate to buy out of slavery, and he just can't raise that kind of money in Canada. He's not formally sponsored by any organization, so it must have taken just enormous savings that he and Julia put together to buy that ticket to get over to England in 1856. He joins a Reverend Spurgeon's huge London tabernacle and publishes The Experience of a Slave in South Carolina. If I have any Baptists out there, my Baptist friends, you may be the ones recognizing Spurgeon. He was a Baptist celebrity of just enormous importance and significance in the 19th century. So this is really a unique, you do not have other enslaved people palling around with Reverend Spurgeon. So I'll talk about that. He falls out with Spurgeon and publishes a furious screed. He is so angry at Spurgeon. He publishes a pamphlet that's sort of crazy, but has a real, I'll say, particular voice to support what he has to say. So the Reverend Charles H. Spurgeon was known as the Prince of Preachers. Estimated he preached over 10 million people. He was, I don't know, Jimmy Swaggart and oh, I don't know who else. Joel Osteen all rolled up in one. And he was absolutely dominant. He was not Church of England, though. He was sort of the people's preacher, the people's pastor. He was a Baptist. And importantly, his denominations in England were not especially activist or anti-slavery. This was not really their cause. I've gone through many concordances of his thousands of sermons, and 99% of the time when he mentions slavery, he's talking about slavery to sin and personal liberation from darkness. He's not really concerned with American issues. But he meets Jackson, who has been speaking at a number of church and pulpits, and he's really touched by Jackson's testimony. And he invites Jackson to speak in his tabernacle to his congregation, which is just had never happened before. And then Spurgeon made a couple of comments afterwards saying, I will never sup with slaveholders, and that I decry, this state. And unfortunately, that word got back to the United States, and there were book burnings, including some in Virginia, I think one or two in Mississippi, and I know of one in South Carolina, right where my university is, where they burned Spurgeon's sermons. Spurgeon canceled his trip to the United States. Jackson was sort of an instigation for this really monumental events with Spurgeon. So he is still today a revered figure in the conservative Baptist tradition worldwide. When I was doing my research, I found on Twitter, there's some Spurgeon fan out there who sort of, created a Twitter account for Charles Spurgeon. It has like some lovely, they're really rather sweet, little inspirational quote from Spurgeon every day that you can enroll in. I'm no longer on Twitter, but I rather miss getting those sort of lovely, uplifting comments from Spurgeon every day on my phone. So there's a view of the Metropolitan Tabernacle. I like showing you this. You can think a man who was taught that he was nothing, that his voice didn't matter, that reason was not to be his, was then speaking to an audience this enormous. The front of the building is still there today, as you can see. The back, the Nazis bombed it, so the back has been totally recreated, but the front of the building is still there, and you can still visit. Okay, in 1862, the Civil War has broken out right now, but he's safe. Jackson is in England with Julia, and he's hanging out with the people in Spurgeon's community. He seems to be getting jobs thanks to the Spurgeon network, but in the summertime, he's traveling around giving lots of lectures. In the wintertime, he's sort of staying home, and he writes this book. Now, note it says by Andrew Jackson. It may have been, I think, heavily edited. Perhaps a little bit of it was dictated, but I have other evidence of his literacy in later life, letters he wrote in the same handwriting across different decades. And so I do believe he actually was functionally literate by this point. The fact that someone could sort of achieve that level of literacy as an adult is, we should pause and that is so rare and such an astonishing accomplishment in itself. I love to think of that. But and the book doesn't get promoted very much. It doesn't get sent to the United States. And part of that, maybe it's mostly, I think, handed out as he gives it, or he's sold at his talks. But he has a fight with Spurgeon. Jackson's up in up in Scotland. And he gets in an argument with somebody. It's a libel. They accuse him of insulting him. And he says, well, Spurgeon is my friend and Spurgeon will vouch for me. And somebody writes a letter to Spurgeon. Spurgeon doesn't respond, but one of his secretaries is like, he doesn't know Jackson very well. Go away. And as a result, Jackson gets in terrible legal trouble, gets sort of run out of Dundee, Scotland. But more importantly, all his speaking opportunities dry up because he's lost the imprimatur, he's lost the voucher, the mentor that he thought he had. So he's furious at Spurgeon, and he publishes this very strange pamphlet, which is a little bit incoherent, and it's really poorly written, and its arguments are sort of all over the place. But that actually, I think, speaks to it being him without an editor. And he says, Spurgeon embezzled money that was raised to help my family. And Spurgeon said they would teach me and my wife at Sunday school, and they don't. And I even think he has liquor in the basement, and he's a Baptist. I mean, Jackson is throwing everything he can at Spurgeon. Who knows where the truth lies? But I actually like to think of it as great evidence of his loud, powerful, unbowing personality, and also his literacy at this moment. So it's a stunning document in the New York Public Library, actually. All right, hang on. We still have, this is pretty much Jackson's memoir ends with him in England, but the life I've tracked goes on for many more decades. It gets stranger and wilder. So hang on to your hats here. By late 1865, he's back in Salem. He's working informally with the Freedmen's Bureau, and he's raising money for destitute people in South Carolina. He settles in Springfield, Massachusetts in the 1860s. He's based there for a few years, but he moves to New Haven, then to Springfield, then back to New Haven. I think he's briefly in Hartford. His addresses are all over the place, but you can tell he's sort of in that general area. And what he seems to be doing over the next decade or so is he's raising money in Massachusetts and New England. And then he's finding goods and bringing money down to South Carolina. He'll take a ship down to South Carolina, distribute food, tools, clothing, and then 4 months later, come back up to New England. So that's sort of his pattern. I can follow this through newspapers because there's a lot of newspapers, especially in Springfield, Massachusetts. But he's covered in many, 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 many newspapers around New England, particularly. Here's a poster from a lecture he gives, a broadside held at the American Antiquarian Society, of him speaking on a boat, actually, but a boat that is docked, which is sort of a nice way to think of an audience going on a boat to hear a talk. And there will be singing on the occasion. I told you he liked to sing. He included songs in most of his presentations. For the next 35 years, he travels back and forth. I think he may have one of the reasons, and this I've got to say, I don't have a lot of evidence for, so I'm careful in how I speculate here. I believe Louisa survived the war. Her name may have been changed. There are some women with similar names. There's a woman who seems to have come back from Georgia, a Black woman of the same age, with a name that I think would have made sense for her if she remarried, who had new families. And so he's in that terrible position that I think a lot of survivors of bondage had, particularly people who had escaped, which is if they had sort of a new life and an old life, and there was no way to make that fit in society. And that also helps explain his constant back and forth to South Carolina for the next couple of decades. But I don't fully know that. His wife, Julia, dies. He gets a third wife that he brings up from South Carolina, a much younger woman named Ella. And he attempts to create something I'm going to call the grist mill scheme. I'll tell you about that. So in 1868, he starts writing to General Howard, O.O. Howard, the head of the Freedmen's Bureau. Okay, so he's not going to low-level people. He's going to basically probably the second highest ranked person in the United States next to the president, which is O.O. Howard. And he says who's running the entire federal occupation of the South. And he says, there's 1,000 acres of land that my master once owned with a grist mill attached, which is to be sold at sheriff's sale. The English family, I'm sure you can all smile. The English family was completely bankrupt and had to sell off a lot of their property. It couldn't have happened to a nastier group of people, I tell you. And even the white neighbors of that era wrote about how horrible the English family was. They were constantly being sued by white neighbors all over town as well. So they were really unpleasant. But anyway, or at least that generation was. But yeah, so he decides he's going to buy out of all the abandoned land in the country he could have tried to fundraise for. He asked money to help raise money to buy this grist mill area and some acres to settle 40 Black families in some sort of utopian sharecropping scheme. It's only $4,000. We wish to buy it for 40 freedmen that once worked as slaves on it with me for a home. I am going to write to many of the clergymen in Europe which know me. I am going to ask them to collect some money and send it to you. If you will consent to be my agent and hold the money, I want to divide it into lots. This is a great deal of timber. It's going to waste. Well, this you can find in the Freedmen's Bureau records. And I am sorry to say General Howard wrote back saying, this is a great scheme. I'll hold the money for you, but I cannot contribute any money for you. And so like a lot of Jackson's schemes and dreams, it never quite happened. But the audacity, again, I think of buying his own enslaver's plantation site really gives you a sense of who he was and his absolute fearlessness. And it would have been a disaster probably. There was incredible violence. A number of white people had been killed in this town, who had come there to help Black people. Sort of early KKK type of action is happening over there. There's spectacular violence against people of color in that area and during that decade. So it's hard to believe that he could have set up this sort of self-sustaining Black community. But it's a heartbreak when you see what did happen to that very site. and that is now the Lee County Correctional Facility. It is a maximum security. It is the site, the exact site of the English family gristmill property, which Jackson had tried to purchase. And the area in the county is desperately poor, perhaps one of the poorest areas in South Carolina, and hence in the nation. And of course, this is the only employer practically of any significance in that county and that township. And it's just a heartbreak to see the different kind of future that developed from that site. In 1881, I came across a little mention in a newspaper saying John Andrew Jackson was arrested in North Carolina for obtaining money under false pretenses. What was this? I knew he'd been running around raising money. I didn't quite know why he was in North Carolina in 1881, but I dove into North Carolina records, of which there were very few, and a strange story unfolded. He was found guilty by an all-white male jury of fraudulent solicitation. He was condemned to 5 years hard labor on a chain gang. This is basically a death sentence. He is about 56 years old. In 1881, however, in August, he was listed as escaping. My dear, how do you escape from a chain gang? He's 56. It didn't make any sense to me. The next record listed as me in the newspaper listed him as recaptured. And then, did he escape again? I don't know. But the next thing I know, he shows up delivering lectures in Vermont by late September of 1881. So these are the facts as I had it. And I couldn't put it together. But then I finally got a great clue, which is in August of 1881, there are about over a dozen newspaper statements in different newspapers that all come out with the exact same language about John Andrew Jackson. It's what I think happened. Now, again, I'm careful about this speculation. I think he escaped briefly and persuaded somebody to post a letter for him before he was recaptured. And the letter would have gone to the Springfield Republican, which was where he had been many, many times. He had been in and out of that newspaper asking them to help him raise money. Saying, send it out, tell them I'm collecting money this week, and I'm going to be at the wharf this week, and anybody wants to bring food donations, I'm collecting them. The Springfield Republican had been publishing about little things about Jackson for years. And the reason I think this is that Springfield Republican ran this really odd little dull paragraph. But being dull is actually very useful, right? And that paragraph then got reprinted or newspapers that week. And the paragraph basically said, the notice said, Mr. John Andrew Jackson, formerly a slave in South Carolina, has been farming in Florence, Massachusetts during the last season. He escaped in 1847 by hiding himself on a ship. He lectured through England, and since the war has been working on behalf of the freedmen, soliciting and forwarding supply. So it's not, right, it doesn't say anything about him being arrested in North Carolina, but it's vouching for his story and for his personality. So I think, and again, I'm mindful of what I know and what I don't know, but I think what happened is this somehow was then brought to the attention of the authorities in North Carolina, who did not want to make it a big legal to-do. I think they were just like, fine, get him out of here, go away, never come back in this state again. We never want to hear you about it again. And Jackson somehow got out of North Carolina. And as I said, shows up lecturing and fundraising in Vermont a few weeks later. So he was never down for long. It's also a nice story of like the media as your greatest defense, and the good people of Springfield who continued to stand by Jackson. By 1893, a wonderful little interview with him appears from Rochester, New York. And he says, I came back to this country. I'm getting old and feeble. I want to get the money for a home. He's trying to raise money for an old person's home down South Carolina, which never comes to be. And this is where I want to die, down in my old cabin home. I have the last records I have of Jackson are of him actually selling a bit of land and sending money back to Massachusetts to some lawyers where I think he's returning the land. And that's in 1899. So I believed he probably died around 1900, 1901, something like that. I've never found his grave. I don't quite know the end of that story. I've looked a lot. I'd like to know closure. I hope he was buried near his brother. He has a brother, Ephraim, who he speaks a lot about in his letters back and forth, trying to help Ephraim and the Ephraim Clavon and the Clavon family. But here's my coda, two parts for you. So when I was working on the book, I wanted to understand cotton in that area of South Carolina. Cotton is handled differently, different species, different strains, different decades, different challenges. And I wanted to know what it was like in that area of Lee County and Sumter County, South Carolina, during Jackson's lifetime. So I started looking at the WPA narratives, which were interviews with formerly enslaved people who had survived into the 1930s. And the federal government set out agents to interview them. And these were oral histories. So I was like, okay, well, I'll look in them. They have a couple from South Carolina. Let's see if I can find some that tell me something about the labor of the cotton in that area. And I came across one that really nearly made me fall off my seat. This is the photograph I took, by the way, of cotton right there still, and probably owned by some big conglomerate, I'm sure, but it's like cotton is still being produced on that land. And here's the interview with a man named Jake McLeod. I hear tell about one man running away from Black Creek and going to Free State, catch ride with people that used to travel to Charleston hauling cotton and things. He come back about 15 years after the war and lived in that place adjoined to me, come back with barrels and boxes of old secondhand clothes and accumulated right smart here. Talk a good deal about how he associated with the whites. Don't know how come he ran away, but they didn't catch up with him till it was too late. And there's a street there in Lynchburg named Clavon Street. The legacy of John Andrew Jackson is, his own life is incredible. But I want to highlight that in the late 1930s, there are plenty of people around today, including in my own family, who were around in the late 1930s. Really only one who would have been able to speak with someone who had known Jackson. Jackson's story was still alive in the Black oral tradition through the 20th century. And it's really had disappeared from all sort of mainstream white histories of South Carolina, of fugitivity, of enslaved people, of even this, the Baptist history of activism in England. And yet, once I started, digging these things out over the decades, the story began to unfold, and I could really hear him speaking to us. So thank you very much for your patience, and I really appreciate you coming to share this story with me. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Susanna. That was wonderful. And I see we already have quite a few questions, but I'm going to share my slides just for a moment to do a couple of housekeeping announcements while anybody else who has questions has a chance to go to the Q&A section and put their questions in there or upvote other people's questions. And then we'll go ahead and talk about those. So I just want to mention that next month's Bookworm, we will be welcoming Jason Cherry, who is an independent historian who explores the life of William Trent, a prominent yet often overlooked figure in colonial American history, in his biography, William Trent, Factor of Ambition. So now that you've signed up for the Clements Bookworm, you'll receive a reminder the day before and an hour before the Bookworm, and you can choose to join live, or we also send an email with all of the resources mentioned during the broadcast, along with a link to the video the afternoon of the program. So you can keep your eye out for that as well. We continue our in-person exhibition, Bloody Work, Lexington and Concord 1775, which explores the early months of 1775 in Massachusetts, the Battle of April 19th and their immediate aftermath. You can visit that in person Monday through Friday, 12 to 4 p.m. through September 19th. But it is also available online. I saw people checking in from all over the world today. So you can take a look at that exhibit online, and we also have the full transcriptions of the manuscripts that are included, as well as wonderful recordings by students from the University of Michigan reading those letters to really bring them to life. So I hope you'll have a chance to check that out. And once again, thank you to the Alumni Association of the University of Michigan for sponsoring today's episode, and also for letting people know about today's episode. I know that I saw that some of you are new to the Bookworm and saw it through their advertising. So we appreciate you joining us today. Go Blue. And as always, if you're interested in getting more involved at the Clements Library through volunteering or joining our programs or donating, you can always contact me. And especially if you're interested in sponsoring a future episode of the Bookworm, please be in touch. You can always respond to the email that I send you reminding you about the Bookworm, or with the one with the video. So, all right. And with that, I see lots and lots of questions.
Can I jump in one more second, Angela? Because I forgot to say something. When Angela first told me and was helping me set up, all the mechanics for this talk, I let her know that my parents both went to the University of Michigan and were very, very dear to their hearts. Their closest friends are all still Michigan folks. But I mentioned especially my dad, who grew up in Tennessee, and he was very poor and wouldn't have had any way to attend. But it wasn't just any old scholarship. It was a University of Michigan alumni scholarship that went to this young man in Tennessee in 1950 something. It changed his life. It changed the trajectory of his entire world. And he went to Michigan, and he then became a lawyer specializing in nonprofit arts law for his entire life, and raised a big family and new generations. And anyway, but with Michigan, it wasn't just any old scholarship. It was a University of Michigan Alumni Association scholarship. So maybe I'll say thank you on his behalf right now. So there you go. Thank you, Michigan.
Thank you. Thank you, Susanna. And I noticed that Peter Eckstein puts in a little blurb saying that he knew your parents and attended an anniversary party that you threw for them.
Oh, yeah.
So that's a fun connection too. I love it. It's a small world, a small, wonderful world sometimes, isn't it? Okay, so yes, thank you. Thank you, everybody. Oh, so good. So Francis is wondering how he learned to write, because you mentioned he's writing in his diary. And so do you have any clues about that?
Well, I have a couple of clues, and I've put them together a little bit carefully, but I can tell you one thing I discovered after I wrote the book. So while I hope you can go out, you can get the book on Bookstore. There's actually a discount code here in the Q&A. But one fact that I'll share with you, because I discovered this after the book, is it was illegal to teach people to read and write in South Carolina, teach Black people to read and write in South Carolina in the 1820s, 30s, 40s, and 50s. It was, enforced vigorously in some places, loosely, and less so in others. It sort of depends on who your enslaver was, how much they cared. But I have since found out that the particular church that the English family attended, and which they had their enslaved people attend, was strangely remarkable in that they actually believed there was a minister there who wanted to teach enslaved people to read the Bible, and actually had a little hut built next to the church where the Sunday school class could teach Black people the rudimentary literacy. So Jackson never mentions it, but it was odd enough to really shock me. And I realized, well, he could have gone a little bit of literacy at that point. He could have gotten some basics. And then he was completely illiterate. He was pretty functionally illiterate during the time he was in Massachusetts. But in Canada, I think he may have started to learn a little bit in Canada, perhaps from his wife, who I might have been literate. And then by the time he's in England, he's talking about trying to read, trying to go to Sunday school with Spurgeon's church. And then you have that book, which it doesn't say dictated to. Most enslaved narratives, if they were dictated, it says so. This was not. It says by Jackson. So as I said, I think it may have been very, very, very heavily edited. But I do think he actually wrote much of it, I think. And then later on, letters, some letters are in different handwritings, which I think, paid somebody or dictated letters, but some of the letters have a consistent signature. And then I have legal documents with his signature. So again, we all know literacy is not an either or. It's a spectrum. There are degrees of literacy and fluidity and fluency. So I think he had what I'm going to call functional literacy towards the end of it, midlife. But again, I'm very careful about how I talk about that and my evidence in the project.
Interesting. Thank you. Um, so I think that there's a couple, I think these two questions could go together or could be sort of separate, that Tom's asking, because he's thinking about how were slave catchers treated in Maine, and were they protected from abolitionists? Were they, accepted? All of those
Mhm.
kinds of things, because, wondering
Right,
about
right.
that a little bit. But then also, if you were supporting the escape of slaves, where did that land you in terms of arrest and prison?
Okay, yeah, no, I can address that. No, it's a really good question because the rhetoric around it got really crazy. There were a couple of horrifying cases of Black people who were free or not free, but who were recaptured and under the Fugitive Slave Act and were sent back south where they disappeared under torture and God knows what, and they're never heard from again. There were a couple of horrifying cases. There were also a couple of cases of white people who were branded or attacked or arrested or had to pay huge fines for having helped enslaved people. There weren't many. I've got to say it was a little more, what didn't happen a lot that white people got in trouble for this, but they could. Now, that's important here, let me give you two comparisons. When he is in Massachusetts, he's staying at this Black sailors boarding house for a while with this really great Black family, the Foreman family, who are free people of color running their own business, in Boston. And a bounty hunter is sent by the English family. Because remember, Jackson he can't disappear completely because he wants his wife and baby. He wants to free his family. So he is getting white people to start raising money and sending letters down south. If you just want to disappear, that's one thing, but he has to be sort of vulnerable. So by sending all these letters down south, the English family has tracked him, and they know he's in Massachusetts. That means they know he probably went through Charleston. That means there are only a couple of boats that it could have been. There are not that many Black boarding houses. That's where you would start asking. So it's not that hard, right? So a bounty hunter does come looking to kidnap Jackson. I am happy to say Jackson is sort of out of town at that moment, and the Foreman family and the Black sailors basically beat the guy up and throw him out violently. So, but they're afraid he's going to come back. So they warn Jackson, do not come back to this area because that slave catcher has it in for you, and there's a bounty hunter. So I mean that tells you, and those free people of color they could have been punished horribly for that. They were very vulnerable, in great danger for what they did. So that sort of tells you that's it would have been very different. Would Harriet Beecher Stowe have been arrested? Probably not. Probably unlikely. She wasn't in that kind of danger. But she was breaking the law unambiguously, absolutely. She was breaking several laws, probably. She was also really violating a lot of etiquette and cultural norms, like bringing this young man into her house. She actually talks of his showing him the stripes on his back, taking his shirt off. I mean, it's very, and her husband's not even there. She was so conservative. She was such a square too. She was so conservative in many ways. Later, when she went on her book tour of England, she made her husband get on stage because she thought it was inappropriate for women to speak in public. Okay, like that tells you something. So she is not radical in those ways. So the idea of the bringing him into the house really might have made her horribly uncomfortable. And the only person she ever spoke of it to was her sister. So that gives you a sense of the kinds of ways people handed and understood and represented the danger they were in. So she wasn't in any legal danger, really. There weren't a lot of cases. There was some issues of white people getting in trouble in Maine, but not a lot. But cultural mores would have been quite that was violated. So
So you mentioned in that, how he's trying to buy his family. And so this question is about, well, so was this an accepted practice? Would slave owners have actually sold him family members or let him
Oh,
buy?
absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Family members who were sold. Yeah, yeah.
So they would have, if he had paid a fair price, let
Oh,
him
oh,
buy.
selling back to him. Oh, that's
Yeah.
a great question. I see what, yeah, yeah. Um, this is really, we need more books written on this. One of the hardest chapters and some of the work I was most proud of, but I was sort of working in a bit of a vacuum, is analyzing these financial transactions. Because what's really important, and those of you who think about these things, you're dealing with a bad faith actor, right? Let's say, I raised a chunk of money to liberate my son from South Carolina. Well, I can't just send the money. You're not going to send cash. It has to be done in careful bank transactions. And the person's completely able to just take the money and then say, whoops, sorry, not sending you. Right. So you're going to have to send somebody down there with all sorts of legal documentation about the transaction. You have to have a lot of lawyers involved. And indeed, there is some incredible documentation. Some of it is in the American Antiquarian Society, and some of it in the Liberator newspaper, where Jackson had people write down south to the English family and to the family that actually enslaved Louisa. It was a different family that enslaved Louisa and tried to buy her back. And they and their neighbors wrote back to Jackson's lawyers saying, she's going to be super expensive. Hope you have a huge amount of money. They tripled her price, just to be evil, just to be
Yeah.
cruel. And they write this mocking letter. So whether or not they would have actually followed through with the transaction, I don't know. He managed to raise I think he was like half of the money. He was like almost there. He's trying to raise the money. He's working day and night doing manual labor and then also asking for charity for this. But before he can complete the transaction, the Fugitive Slave Act's passed. So he's in Massachusetts for like 2 years before he has to flee to Maine and then up north.
Okay. Um, I think you adequately answered this question that Marianne had about you know, slave narratives potentially being written through somebody else. And so you had
Some
mentioned,
were, some weren't. Yeah.
yeah, that you think his was probably edited rather than delivered verbally to somebody.
Yeah.
Okay. So let's see. Tom is just thinking about the Quakers and thinking about their role in the Midwest Underground Railroad and wondering, were they active in New England? Did he encounter Quakers?
No, that's a great question because here's the surprising answer. Get this. The English family had been Quakers. I
Oh,
know, right? There were a fair amount of Quaker settlements in the Carolinas up through the Revolutionary War. And it was sort of the generation right after the Revolutionary War that the Quakers who had really disavowed slaveholding pretty much left. And the Quakers that remained either had to pretty much became Presbyterians. And that is the story of the English family. So yeah, let's just, it's a complicated history, isn't it? There were many,
yes.
there were Stowe admired the Quakers. She was not herself a Quaker, but actually in Uncle Tom's Cabin, there's a beautiful chapter about a Quaker family that does one Quaker family that helps people escape. So there were certainly Quakers who helped. I remember reading one advice in I think it was Frederick Douglass's newspaper. He advises people if you make it to Philadelphia, if you make it, look for people wearing a flat Quaker style hat because that they can be trusted. Um, but there are difficult people in every community in every organization, and people are messy. So I hope that helps a little bit with that question.
Thank you. Yeah, people are messy. So Marianne is wondering, how small are these circles? Did Jackson encounter Solomon Northrop, author of 12 Years a Slave?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Um, That's a great question too. Actually, I don't know about any encounter with Solomon Northup, but I know he did meet with other black and white activists. When he was in Massachusetts, there were a number of free black activists in Salem, in Boston, and out in Worcester, and Springfield, who were ministers and activists, and some of them were former slaves themselves. So he actually did sort of begin to make those networks and those connections. I think they're the people who said got him speaking events and made the key introduction so he could begin to, start doing these conversations. But he didn't move in the circle with Frederick Douglass. Who famously had this enormous speaking tour. I mentioned in one of my slides, he was sort of a free agent. I mean, later he hooked up with the Baptists, and that was really helpful. But he wasn't sponsored by any official organization. And there were a bunch of official anti-slavery organizations that you sort of usually needed to be associated with. And that sort of tells you he's later on, somebody in England says, well, we want to get he may be a fraud. He may be a charlatan. This is a newspaper article. We're going to check his story out with the American Anti-Slavery Association. And Jackson wrote back to the newspaper. I was like, I don't know who those people are. Did they help me when I was in South Carolina? No, they did not. Why are they going to help me here? Why should we listen to my story? It's true. So he is really indignant that he needed, sponsorship.
Interesting. Okay. So Janet is wondering, how did Jackson get captured after his first escape?
I'm not sure I quite understand the question.
I know, I'm trying to think of the narrative that you gave and whether or not maybe this ended up getting answered at some point. But Janet, if you have a chance, type in more about what you're asking. That will help. Okay.
These are good questions.
Yeah.
They're more complicated than the ones I usually get. So I like this audience.
Yeah, I'm always impressed by the questions and the conversation that we have with our people.
Well, while you're consolidating the next question, I'll say something. So my current project, I have a number of different projects going on, but one of them I just signed a contract. I'm going to try to write a young people's version of this book. But the real issue is going to be like it'll be the story of Jackson, and it's going to be called Belonging to Myself.
Oh, wow.
The phrase he uses, belonging to myself. And it's going to be a primer or a primer for how for young people to do primary source research. One chapter is going to be about Jackson, that's how to read a census. And the next chapter is going to be about Jackson, but how to read a court case. The next one's going to be about Jackson, but it's how to read a letter. The next one's going to be how to read a receipt. So these are each how to read an oral interview. So with little tips for sort of high school students because nowadays young people have access to primary sources that they just couldn't have had before. It's a marvelous age to embolden young people. So it's gonna be the story of Jackson, but it's gonna be through documents for young people to sort of learn and feel the power of their own way to interpret history.
Oh my gosh, I love that so much. So yeah, we look forward to hearing more about it and letting people know when it comes out.
But I'll take another question. What's out there?
All right. So Vincent's wondering if you have any thoughts about why Uncle Tom became a negative symbol.
This is not my area of expertise. So I want to be sort of humble and careful in my response. Not just because I'm a white lady in late 21st century, but also because it's just hard to know. I think the book has some offensive stereotypes. Like just because it's anti-slavery doesn't mean it's necessarily anti-racist. So the book itself has some really not just troubling language, but for Stowe, the lighter skinned characters mysteriously speak proper English, and the darker skinned characters all speak in a heavier dialect. Things like that are very troubling. So the book itself has a lot of sort of offensive stereotypes. So and there were many Black readers who didn't like Frederick Douglass talks about, I'm grateful for the power of this work, but I don't like it that much. So there are a lot of problems with the book itself. And so that may have sort of planted the seed for people being a little, Black readers in particular, being a little concerned with it. And then when the play came out, it often was made into be a musical, and people would come out singing and dancing, and often really stupid, clownish action. And it would focus much more on some of the white characters, and some of the Black characters were not taken seriously. And so I think that really also helped sort of poison the concept. James Baldwin in the 20th century wrote a famous article about how terrible Uncle Tom's Cabin is. It wasn't totally clear to me he had read the book, but he found it a racist concept. And it just, culture does what it does, and it turns things around. So the term Uncle Tom became a, serious insult to Black people who have not supported other Black people, I guess. Perhaps that might be a way to think about it. Although, again, I do want to say in the novel itself, Uncle Tom he's a Jesus figure who is loving and kind and pious, and then stands up to an overseer to protect women who are, fleeing torture, and he dies on a whip by being whipped. And so he dies this great resistant martyr's death. But, that's whatever. So there you go. I mean, it's a useful term today because it serves a cultural purpose in a different way. So,
yeah.
History is messy.
Okay, so Janet has clarified her question, and she is saying that you mentioned that he escaped from the English plantation twice.
That may have been my phrasing. I guess when I meant he did in 2 stages.
Two stages. Okay.
Yes, that was my messy phrase. So he got to Charleston, and he sort of was there for a few weeks trying to sort of figure out how to sneak onto a boat. And that was his first escape, which it's important because he did it on his own, right? This was not an underground. There's no underground railroad in South Carolina. Yeah, he did it himself. And it was only when he got to Massachusetts where he begins to meet Black and white activists who start helping him a little bit. But before he can really meet the dream of the Fugitive Slave Act passes, and he cannot free his wife and child. He cannot get Louise and Ginny back. And that's when he has the second great escape, which is up through Massachusetts and Maine up into Canada. So yeah, that was my phrasing. So apologies.
Okay, great. Yeah. So not so much. Yeah, right. So I have 2 questions / comments about genealogy. Wondering if you have encountered any of Jackson's descendants, and also could genealogists then sort of help figure out where he's buried?
I love you, genealogists. Yes, genealogy is all over my book. And I'll start with this. I forgot. Yes, I have met his descendants, many of his descendants. Okay. So when I finally realized that the name Clavon and iterations of the name Clavon went into the next generations, but I couldn't really, I suddenly realized that the way I could track the family was mysteriously in every generation. And it wasn't direct. Sometimes it was cousins to cousins type of things. There was a young man who'd be named Doctor as a first name, right? And so I began, and of course, each of these generations, they thought they'd been named after their uncle or his father, but they'd actually been, named to honor the original patriarch, Dr. Clavon, who was the leader, and one of the few people in, the plantation labor camps who could provide some sort of solace and care, right, as sort of a medical figure as much as they could have it. It's so touching. Anyway, I've met many of the Clavons. They kindly invited me to a family reunion in South Carolina. I talk about them a little bit in the beginning of my book, including a gentleman who's a friend of mine now, Dr. Doc Clavon. He has a PhD. He's been in the armed forces. They're actually his branch of the family. They've been in like all sorts of different services, the Navy, the Army, all sorts of armed support and service and defense of the United States, which is really cool. I also met a whole lot of ministers, a whole lot of preachers, and a whole lot of people in sales. So I'm telling you, I think the gift of the gab went through the family because they are great, charismatic, big personalities. So it's a remarkable generations that have survived South Carolina today.
Cool. Thank you so much. Annette has one of my favorite questions. What are the most surprising and exciting steps in your research?
Well, that moment I when I saw that I gave you in my coda of Jake McLeod, where I was just looking for references about cotton. And I'm sorry, did I freeze there? Oh,
You
okay.
did, but I think you're okay.
That moment when I was reading the oral histories and I suddenly went, they're talking about Jackson, and even he talked a lot about how he associated with. You really got a sense, once again, of Jackson's personality just coming through this oral history. I think that was a really shocking moment. But the biggest moment was, and I don't think I fully told this. So I was collecting all these little known South Carolina narratives of bondage and sort of reading through them and working with them. I sort of did a little edited collection of them, but I didn't know anything about Jackson. I couldn't find out much about him at that time. Both my skills were not what they were, and I wasn't really focused on it. And also the internet wasn't what it was. I didn't have the all card. But later on, I was looking at Jackson, and he's funny. He's witty. He's funny. He's got all these little asides. I mean, you don't expect witness testimony of bondage and enslavement to be funny, but he is. And he had this little section where he said, oh yeah, and then I visited with Harriet Beecher Stowe and she hid me and I talked to her kids and I showed her my back and she gave me money the next morning. And I just sort of thought, as I said, he was exaggerating it. And then I learned there was some unpublished, and it wasn't unknown, scholars had read it, but there was this unpublished letter by Stowe that was held at Yale. And she never mentions the name of the enslaved person. And when I put those two things together, that was the other revelation. That was the moment that blew my mind. So that got in the New York Times, that got a lot of media coverage, and that sort of launched where I was like, okay, this is a book. But then I always like to say, I love to see, we use Uncle Tom's Cabin as sort of the hook for my book, but I'm really interested in Jackson's own book.
Right.
Sort of the two books that can come out of this small encounter for one night, two people who've had very different trajectories about what testimony and narrative and what words can change the world.
Yeah, definitely. Well, on that note, I think we should wrap up because that was great. And it was a pleasure to have you on the program. And thank you, everybody, for your great questions and for your attentiveness to this program. And Susanna, we can't wait for this wonderful, next book with the primary sources. That's going to be amazing as well in a whole different way. So that's
Thank you.
great.
Thank you. Yeah, and if anyone has any ideas, I'm happy to speak with other audiences. So do reach out. I have a website. So cheers. Thank you.
All right. Thanks so much. Bye, everybody. Have a good weekend.